Hey everybody, and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program RP-0. We are starting off with our Twitch recap from last Sunday, which was mostly uneventful. We were continuing the Aero breaking passes for faithful Chestnut here, as it had several more passes to make to lower its orbit into something that might get us a reasonable rendezvous speed with Harmonia Station. So I spent most of the live stream hanging out with chat and just kind of discussing random things while we made many passes through the upper Martian atmosphere, slowing ourselves down bit by bit. Eventually, we would lower our periapsis into the 50-some kilometer range so that we could get more effective braking in hopes of slowing ourselves down just a little bit sooner. The ultimate goal here was to end up docked to Harmonia Station by the end of the live stream, which, of course, was not to be a thing. Fear not, however, we have completed the rest of those. But after several passes with our periapsis down to about the 50-kilometer range, we are getting somewhere between 120 and 130 or so some odd meters per second of free displacement per pass. And it was, well, the resultant curve is exponential. It is not linear. And as much as I would really like it to be linear, the fact that your lower apoapsis means that you enter the atmosphere sooner and you spend a longer time collecting drag for the same periapsis, means that your total displacement of delta V will increase run for run, even if you touch absolutely nothing. As you can see, most of these passes were made without ever turning on the RCS or ever making a single correction whatsoever, but our total displaced delta V tends to consistently go up. Now, after a run or two, we would actually increase that periapsis back up to something a little more reasonable. But it was this pass when we started at 1.7 million meters where things started to go a little haywire. Well, we'll see. I'll plot a node next pass and see what we're looking at for. Yeah, it is changing fast. We're almost on our way back up. If we have to light the engine, we will. I forgot to quick save. Oh, oh boy, we are. Yeah. Reduce our drag profile. Yeah, if it starts to get close, we may just turn and burn. But we are coming up out of the thicker stuff somewhat. Still falling pretty quick, but I don't think pitching us around a whole lot is going to matter. Okay, I was going to say, this number isn't changing. Yeah, now it's changing. Just hold steady, sweetie. Yeah, this is definitely our last pass. Hey, Phobos. Alright, come on, sweetie. Ban a letter? A random letter? I believe. Oh, yeah, wow. We have displaced almost 200 meters per second this pass. Come on, 54. Okay. Can... engine's not ullaged. Thought the turning would certainly help keep it ullaged. And that is too much braking. Alright, here you go, sweetie. Nope, nope, nope. Not as bad as we think that it is. Okay, I think actually we're going to be alright. We're just going to get up to our apoapsis, and we're going to make a correction. That's all this is. Okay, well, thank you. This is what I get for being so really stupidly distracted and trying to think that I could do this and talk, and that thinking the curve is linear. It is not linear. It is absolutely exponential, especially when you get down to this low of an atmosphere. 7 ignitions remaining. How high was apogee or apoapsis before this pass? That's a really good question. I want to say it was 1 or 2 million. It was definitely not in the hundreds of kilometers range. Well, after that slightly heart-stopping encounter, we would go ahead and put ourselves into a slightly better orbit. This was actually the very, very tail end of the live stream. I did run out of time, so a good chunk of this episode will be stuff that I did after the live stream, just fold it all into one episode, because I'm not going to make you watch me make aero-braking passes around Mars for any longer than I absolutely have to. We did get that little problem with the thruster sorted out. It did take us a little while to figure, but apparently only 3 of the forward, the H key translation thrusters were firing with all 4 solar panels extended, and this is just some weird bug with Kerbal Space Program. So we have to retract 2 of our solar panels opposite that 4th thruster that is not firing in order for it to operate. To think that it is not stowed for some reason that I absolutely positively cannot fathom. It's real weird, but it is in fact a thing. We can operate the spacecraft successfully or nominally on only 2 solar panels. It's just not what I would like. I would like the charge rate of all 4 solar panels extended. So it's just a matter of when we have maneuvers to make, we need to tuck 2 of those panels away. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of situations where we actually need to make maneuvers on these thrusters. As a matter of fact, after docking is complete, we will only need to ullage the engines for our return burn for Earth, and then maybe a mid-course correction, and I'm absolutely 100% certain that I will positively remember to fold out the other 2 panels for the rest of the return trip. We did have a little bit of IVA fun, although we've all seen the inside of a Mark III cabin before, so it's nothing quite spectacular. The new dawning threat was that we're running quite low on RCS propellant, which is all really, really new. This is the first time where I've not had a single tank that provided for both the engine and the RCS thrusters. This engine does run on kerosene and liquid oxygen, so having the nitrogen tetroxide and Aerozine 50 just for the RCS itself was a little new to me. And well, kind of a shock, seeing as how quickly we ran through it. Although these big, powerful thrusters are absolutely hungry, we do have one more centralized tank right there at the waistline of the spacecraft that is still locked, but it only has about 2,000 or so liters of each fuel, which, considering we need to make a plane correction maneuver, and then we need to make an intercept maneuver, might not be enough. So we could be using one of our 7 ignitions on one of those burns just to get things kind of sorted out. Anyway, this was the official end of the live stream, and we'll just do a very quick transition here into things that are not live stream, where I picked up shortly after setting the maneuver to set up our intercept maneuver. It's just a few hours away, and it was kind of a bit of trouble making it so that it didn't carry us through the upper atmosphere of Mars. So we'll pull in those 2 solar panels so that we can actuate on all 4 of those thrusters. They do provide the vast majority of our forward thrust, and using those keys, we will work through the majority of this 60 some odd meter per second burn so that we can start to bring down our separation at closest approach. Notice that number has started to fall. It was rising at the very beginning of this maneuver because, well, we were well ahead of the maneuver. Thanks to physics warp, this whole thing does not take very long, and we can get it down to right about 20 kilometers, and then we'll just start leaning on random keys. I think it was J and K alternately that helped us work it down to less than 1 kilometer separation at closest approach, which is ideal. I mean, typically I would like to see it less than 100 meters separation at closest approach, but you know, can't beggars can't be choosers, I suppose. So it was a good long while hanging on these thrusters, trying to dial that whole thing in, but this is kind of our standard rendezvous procedure at this point. Press random buttons until the number goes down, and hold them until the number starts to go up, and then switch to a different button. Super scientific and absolutely 100% accurate. Anyway, we are finally starting to get that number down to the sub 1 kilometer range. I mean, very, very slowly. The closer you get, typically the harder it is to get in that range, but we are able to actually work it down to less than 300 kilometers, I should say. And then we will use Mech Jeb to set our match velocities at closest approach, which comes out to be only about 36.1 meters per second. And in my infinite hubris, I thought, hey, maybe we can just go ahead and do this on the back of our RCS system, because it does tend to displace a whole lot of delta V very, very quickly. But as you can see here, our fuel levels are incredibly low, a grand total of about 500 liters per fuel, times 2 for each of our fuel, and a very, 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 very long pause, long enough that I could actually take the doggos outside and get myself a fresh beverage before it actually rendered in our space station, which is coming up behind us. And laying on the thrusters a whole lot was just not displacing nearly as much speed as I needed it to do. And in the wake of, well, in the threat of about leaving the station, when we got ourselves equal, we just went ahead and used an ignition. That burned off the rest of that extraordinarily quickly, 4.42 current TWR on that Block 5 engine. So we would get ourselves angled in, And note that our fuel is supremely low, less than 300 liters per fuel. We'll get ourselves on course for a rendezvous when I've kind of made the executive decision that we do not have enough fuel to dock. This is definitely going to be a problem. We will fold in our solar panels because we have plenty of electric charge, and we'll just coast on batteries for a little while. But yeah, like I said, I don't think it has enough fuel to dock, but we do have this resupply pod just kind of hanging out here, and we do have an abundance of Aerozine 50 and nitrogen tetroxide, so we, might as well use some of it. So we'll fuel up one of our resupply pods here, and make sure that it can target Chestnut itself so that we can get rid of our signal delay that will be operating with just a couple of hundredths of a second signal delay since the spacecraft isn't so entirely close. But I would like to not send out a completely unbalanced load of fuel. So we'll try to normalize out our aerozine and nitrogen tetroxide before hitting undock, and then pulling this supply pod clear of Harmonia Station. Now, this thing was intended to deorbit that life support pod that it was docked to, that is now currently docked to the station, as soon as that life support pod could be emptied out anyway, which doesn't appear to be now or anytime soon. And now the fun part of waiting. We'll just put it on course for Faithful Chestnut, at least in the hopes that we can top off its thruster reserves and then have enough sitting around to get it docked. So we'll switch over to Chestnut and let it target in on that resupply pod and just adjust its angle. We'll also set the computers of both to just hold target relative prograde and then wait. Relative speed between them is about half a meter per second, and with time warp being so fickle, uh, when you're within range of other things, I didn't necessarily want to chance it for fear that Harmonia Station would go careening through something. So we just kind of left this alone, and I sat back in my chair and enjoyed myself a beverage and just watched this nice, clean, easy approach happen in very, very, very slow real time. So yeah, I've sped this all up about 4 times for all of you, but you can still see that there was a quite a long approach. Not being able to just even physics warp through these situations is kind of annoying, but really it's just annoying for me. We are closing the gap pretty steadily. Mech Jeb is telling us that it'll take about 2 minutes and 50 seconds for me. That really comes down to less than a minute for all of you before we start to make our rendezvous. It's telling us a 3-meter separation at closest approach, which is probably accurate considering our prograde vector and our target prograde are just a little bit off, but we'll correct that as we get a little bit closer. Really, the goal here is that Chestnut can maintain a lot of its relative velocity to Harmonia Station so that we can keep pulling around to the opposite side there. I think the easiest docking is going to be to that life support pod where this resupply pod was previously docked. Although ideally we would swing all the way around another 90 degrees and dock to the open docking port. Just with all the stuff that sits around there and the bulk of this spacecraft, I'm not really sure that's a viable option, all things considered. So we are on our final closest approach for our resupply pod, and had I been thinking about it, I would have gone ahead and filled this thing up with life support supplies and such too, and maybe just taken that extra pod with us as we went in for docking. I just wasn't sure that Chestnut could carry that much. Anyway, we have hard dock. Yay! And not too much of a loss as far as our relative inclination with Harmonia Station, so we will just start pumping fuel around. Of course, we brought a bit too much, but that's fine. After this is done and complete, we can go ahead and deorbit that resupply pod. That saves us, I don't know, 12 parts, something like that. Anyway, it is enough to completely refuel the two waste tanks, both on the command pod slash habitat and on the service module, and then completely refuel the four primary tanks on the RCS blocks. They do have nose cone tanks also, but we didn't really bother with that because we did want to leave some fuel in the resupply pod itself so that we could go ahead and deorbit that thing and save ourselves the part count. But of course, with smaller tanks, the fuel transfer does take considerably longer, irritatingly longer or so, but this is the most exciting part of any Cosmonaut Crash video, resource transfer. So we can watch those tanks slowly fuel themselves up and also watch our total Delta V figures down there at the bottom dwindle away to less than 1 kilometer per second. Fantastic. I really wonder what that figure is going to read after we get that Lima resupply pod docked to this station. But that's neither here nor there. So we will reset our target for Harmonia Station now that the fuel transfer has been completed. We do need to just move a touch bit of fuel around in the resupply pod. The ratio is still just a little bit off, but it's not terrible. And we'll leave it with enough fuel. 243 meters per second is way more than enough for it to deorbit itself. We probably could have gone with about a fourth of that, but that's a lot of math and stuff. So we'll get it angled clear of all of our relative things, light up that AJ10, and then just leave it lit until we see that periapsis go negative, and then quickly switch back to Harmonia Station and then on over to Chestnut. I would really rather not have to switch to the map view to get into an active vessel. Yeah, I don't want to have to go to map view to have to come back to this stuff. So we're just going to assume that thing's going to deorbit. I never bothered to shut down the engine, so it should run itself dry and pile itself into the dirt, hopefully obliterating absolutely every single part of it. And now we can begin our very long, slow, easy approach to Harmonia Station here in Mars orbit. Now I do need to make some adjustments because we're coming in low and we need to come in wide because I think the easiest docking port is going to be that life support tank that resupply pod just undocked from. And now that we have a whole lot of thruster fuel to deal with, we'll just go ahead and use it all by using physics warp. Now that we don't have 3 vessels to worry about, if something shifts, I can pop back out of physics warp just as quick as I came. Anyway, so we are coming up here on our approach, so we will zero out our relative velocity, set our target for our docking node, and then very graciously get ourselves angled in. We are more laden with fuel than we used to be, but the maneuvers are still fairly easy considering we don't have a whole lot of kerosene and liquid oxygen that we have to start lugging around, slowing us down, increasing our tonnage. But once we've got our relative angle, I don't really know how to define this. Like, once we're in position, we'll be facing the right way, although we're currently not facing the right way. We just have to move laterally until we are, and then a couple of taps from the H key once we're a whole lot closer, and we can start to dial this whole dumb thing in. Now, I did set the computer to hold target relative prograde, or, lock onto target and such, which is really, really nice, except angles. You can't dock it at this angle. So we would just make a slight nudge, back ourselves off, zero everything out, and then knowing that the computer was going to hold that nose in, we could just kind of translate laterally until we kind of flatten things out, and then start to ease ourselves in across several axes until very, very, very finally we could get an approach that actually lets the crew dock. Now, unfortunately, this life support tank is not CLS compliant, so to get crew into the lab and to get them to actually start working and doing things will require an EVA. Not that it's a bad thing. We've got a whole lot of EVA style work that we have to do at this station before we can begin work in earnest and before we can deploy our Mars base. Which, man, that's going to reduce our part count and increase our frame rate by so much. I really cannot wait to do it. So, after a very long dance, we finally have hard dock. And we'll top off some fuel and check off our resources and everything, but I'll do all that off camera. That's going to do it for this episode, everybody. Thank you so much for hanging out. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see all of you in the next one. So, until then, see you later.